Good afternoon. I am the designated Iran explainer-in-chief this morning, and I'll do my best. I also think that it's important to mention, as Rob told me last week, that this is the first time that the Wilson Center has had a discussion on the issue of anti-Semitism.
It's not the first time.
It isn't the first time. Oh, but it's a rare time. In any event, I think Israel in general has found its place as a topic in politics, and the subject of Jews has its place in the discussion of history, but anti-Semitism is sort of homeless because it's just bad news. And I think if it's going to be addressed or eradicated, it needs to be owned first and foremost as a subject and as a topic. So I think it's important, whether it's the first time or not, that we're having this discussion here this morning. I want to take you back to a moment in Iran, in Iranian Jewish history, because I think it's an emblematic moment and is uncommonly illuminating. The moment happened on May 9th, 1979, nearly 3 months after the victory of the Iranian Revolution in the previous February that year. That morning, the Jewish community of Iran woke up to the news of the execution of its leading figure, the industrialist Habib Elghanian. His crime was friendship with the enemies of God, Israel and the Zionists, and sowing corruption on earth. That was your crime too, Hale?
Sorry?
Were you sowing corruption on earth when you got arrested?
Why don't you continue? We really have very little time.
What made Elghanian's execution particularly shocking was that he had felt profoundly loyal to and grounded in Iran. His confidence was not his alone. It was the source of the community's confidence also. He had been key in modernizing Iran's industry through, above all, the introduction of plastic to Iran's manufacturing. Because of all this and many more contributions, he assumed that the nation's gratitude had him immune against any malice. On the morning of his execution, ripples of fear shook the foundation of the community as a whole. And the question everyone was asking was, who was going to be next? Or did Elghanian's faith, like his confidence, belong to all? Within hours, the Jews of Tehran decided to take the most drastic measure of all, to pay a visit to Ayatollah Khomeini at his residence in Qom, the equivalent of the Vatican for Shiite Iran, in the hopes of receiving his personal guarantee about the community's safety. An ad hoc assembly consisting of 2 rabbis and 4 young Jewish intellectuals sympathetic to the revolutionary cause were selected for the job. As university students, they too had taken to the streets and demonstrated against the old Pahlavi regime. They intended to tell the Ayatollah that they were not political Zionists. It was a distinction they had fashioned for themselves, and what they really meant by it was that they saw no other homeland for themselves than Iran. The rabbis, on the other hand, merely wished to plead with him, with the Ayatollah, to be good to the community and tell him of one of the lesser-known pillars of Judaism, that true Jews are ones who share in the wishes of the society in which they live. And now that Iranian society wished to establish an Islamic Republic, so did every good Jew. The next day before sunrise, the group piled into a station wagon and headed for Qom. They vowed, no matter what transpired, not to leave the Ayatollah's home until they had heard the words of assurance, a statement with which to hearten the community of their security under the new regime. They arrived late in the afternoon. they found the Ayatollah's residence surprisingly empty of the usual throng of disciples. Soon they learned that the quiet was in the honor of their visit. Waiting was unnecessary. Immediately after they were guided into the press room and had yet to seat themselves on the rug, the Ayatollah arrived. Surprise caused a minor disarray. One of the rabbis rose to his feet, following suit. The second rabbi also stood. The Ayatollah then refused to sit until the rabbis had sat down, and so there was some mayhem. And then when they were all together in a circle on the floor, one of the rabbis addressed the Ayatollah. He congratulated him on the political victory against the Shah and expressed the community's joy in the new order. As every true Persian speech always concludes with a poem, so did the rabbi end his with a verse. In it, the prophets were likened to the sun and the moon, and the wise clergy to the brightest of the stars. Then the Ayatollah spoke. This is a direct quote. All three prophets were sent by God to guide mankind. All those heretical religions on earth never tended to the soul of mankind, but the three monotheistic religions do. They are the only religions to descend directly from heaven. They have an instruction about every aspect of human life. That's what they have in common. The Ayatollah went on for a while, at times seeming to perfectly derail from the theme of the conversation, until he finally came to the point that had brought the assembly to his doorstep. In the Holy Quran, Moses has been mentioned more than any other prophet. Prophet Moses was a mere shepherd when he stood up to the might of the Pharaoh and destroyed him. Moses represented Pharaoh's slaves, the downtrodden, the mustaz'afin of his time. The moment the Ayatollah used the celebrated term, the downtrodden, or mustaz'afin, as he put it in Persian, the equivalent of the celebrated Marxist term, the proletariat, to refer to the enslaved Israelites, the six men became confident that their journey had not been in vain. That day, the Ayatollah ended his remarks with these words: Moses would have nothing to do with the Pharaoh-like Zionists who run Israel. And our Jews, the descendants of Moses, have nothing to do with them either. We recognize our Jews as separate from those godless, blood-sucking Zionists. End quote. These were the magic words. We recognize our Jews as separate from those godless, blood-sucking Zionists. Imam Khomeini was painted on the walls of every synagogue, Hebrew school, and kosher butchery throughout Iran by nightfall. This quote has yet to be recognized as one of the most life-sparing in modern history, but in truth it is. The fledgling regime's policy toward the Jews was delivered in that conversation, and it has, albeit precariously, remained in effect 35 years since it was first spoken. In light of it, Iranian Jewry remain physically safe, but that is about all. The sea change of laws that swept through the country since 1979 have made it impossible for the community, or any religious community for that matter, to thrive. There were some 100,000 plus Jews living in Iran in the 1970s. They were, for the most part, visible as Jews, proud as Iranians, and they lived throughout the country. Today, despite the bloated governmental statistics of 25,000, no more than 10,000 continue to live in Iran. They're no longer visible, and they have retreated into only 2 or 3 major cities. By Western standards, Iranian Jews are an endangered species on the verge of extinction, but you will not see any bumper stickers or lapel buttons about them. Why does this community warrant our attention today in Washington? It is not the first time in mankind's history that a population has vanished from its original land, much less so in the history of the Middle Eastern Jewry. But as the Moses versus Pharaoh tradition of Passover mandates us, as thinkers, historians, and policymakers, we must also ask, why is this community different from every other? For starters, because despite the most vociferous, vehement, and steadfast support that Iran has given to lethal anti-Israeli groups such as Hezbollah, and despite all the denials of the Holocaust that the officials have spewed, Iran remains the second largest home to the Jews in the Middle East, second only to Israel. If Turkey were to be considered as part of the Middle East, then the two nations are tied for the second place. Jews are attached to Iran because they have far greater historical claim to it than Muslims do. Iran was home to Jews before Islam had come into being. But the unfriendly regime also needs its Jews because it needs to substantiate its claim of Islamic democracy and tolerance. It needs to prove itself as a regional hegemony and unique in contrast to its predominantly Arab neighbors. It needs to prove Persianness, its uniqueness, its tolerance. It needs to debunk the accusations of anti-Semitism by being able to point to its homegrown Jews. But there is more wisdom to be gotten about a regime that rules a nation of nearly 70 million by zooming our policy camera on a group that makes up 0.01% of the total population of Iran. By doing so, in the very least, what we do is what Thurgood Marshall once advised. We evaluate the quality of a society by looking into the state of its most vulnerable individuals. Nothing is more telling about Iran and the regime's conduct than the way it has dealt with the Jewish community since 1979. To truly learn about the nature of the Islamic Republic of Iran, one needs to forego yellow cake and uranium and look through the lens of the religious minority to see through the machinations and the modus operandi of the regime. Doing so will wipe away at the famously enigmatic nature of Iran. But there is another reason. In a region where hostilities against Israel has been steadily growing, in a country that has an official holiday called Quds Day, against Israel's Independence Day, where people are encouraged to take to the streets and protest Israel's existence, anti-Semitism is at its lowest in the region. The suggestion that the Iranian nation was going in the opposite direction of its government came in the form of an extensive report by Timothy Garton Ash in the New York Review of Books more than 10 years ago. In his travels to Iran, Ash had observed an unusually sexualized society, despite the official attempts at modesty and self-control, had even been invited to an orgy, and, among others, made an unusual observation. Iranians are growing curious, if not friendly, toward Israel. In 2006, when the war between Hezbollah and Israel broke out, and people throughout the Middle East were conducting violent protests against Israel, a New York Times front-page story reported that there were no such protests in Iran. Later, there was a report of an unusual and costly slogan chanted by Iranian protesters whose words were, "Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, I give my life only for Iran." The ADL report of several months ago, which Walter spoke about, confirms this pattern. Iran is the least anti-Semitic nation in the Middle East today. Why is it so? I will spend the next several months here at the Wilson Center to get to the bottom of it. But in the meantime, I think this is a watershed shift. What I can say, and perhaps prematurely, is that this disenchantment of the nation in its ruling elite translate into choosing the exact opposite of what the official propaganda wishes the people to do, think, and behave. The lower the popularity of the regime plummets, the higher grows the esteem of the nation in everything the regime shuns and is against. This can be mere reactionariness on the part of the Iranian regime. Nonetheless, it presents a major opportunity for a possible shift and perhaps an unprecedented dialogue between the world Jewry and the people of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roya. Roya, let me ask you the first question. When you grew up in Iran,
Yes.
did you, before the revolution,
Yes.
did you sense
I was there 5 years after the revolution,
did
too.
you sense a difference between yourself and your neighbors who were Muslims and so on, or was there a talk at home about discrimination, anti-Semitism?
I was about 12 when the revolution took place, and
So you were going to school?
I was going to school, and I was going to a Hebrew school. So most of my all of my classmates were Jewish also. I used to have neighbors, and I used to befriend a girl in the neighborhood, especially about whom I talk about in my memoir, because her sister was executed, and they had a very tragic destiny after the revolution. I think I ran into the concept of najas, or unclean, because non-Shiites don't undergo the proper ablutions or the cleaning of themselves at their home, because I realized that every time I ate there, I ate in the same chipped china plate. So they were clearly setting the china plate aside for me. But it didn't. But that was about it. I mean, my understanding of what anti-Semitism was, what came to me through my father's recollections. But after the revolution, things changed drastically, and there were a lot of segregations.
What is the difference between being anti-Semitic and and questioning the right of Israel to exist? After all, we don't hear people being anti-French without being anti-France. What is the real difference there?
Roya?
I had to sort through this question for myself a few weeks ago, because I have said it over and over again that even though I lived through the Iran-Iraq war for several years in Iran, the war in Gaza was the first one that I personally felt in a way that I had never felt, even the war that I lived through all the way here in the United States. It was an astonishing experience, and I'm not sure why I felt it so much, but perhaps social media has something to do with it. What I came to and wrote about in a relatively extensive article was that I think in the criticism that Israel was getting, I had to see whether those who were criticizing recognized also the right of Jews to be in that land, meaning that the criticisms that were being directed at Israel, or the support that was being given to the cause of the Palestinians, came at the cost of disqualifying Jews for being in Israel or not. That was a personal criterion that I invented for myself. And for my part, since I talked about the Iranian community, I think that it has hardly, not until recently, was part of the conversation within the intellectual society of Iran that that Jews had a right to be in Israel just as much as the Palestinians did. And it's only recently that I think the tide has turned and people are considering the two-state solution and so on and so forth. So this is how I thought about it.
اگر بارها دنبال واژه آموزش گشته اید ولی با درهای بسته روبرو شده اید، اگر دنبال آموزشکده‌ای گشته اید که دور نباشد و استادهای خوبی هم داشته باشد، اگر مشتاق آموختن هستید اما توانایی مالی کافی نداشته اید که بیشتر و بیشتر بخوانید و بدانید، اگر شبها وقت آزاد دارید و روزها نمیتوانید دنبال درس و کلاس بروید، توانا بهترین انتخاب شماست. توانا بود هر که دانا بود. توانا رایگان در اختیار شماست. آموزشکده‌ای در خانه شماست. هر وقت که بخواهید، شب یا روز. با درس‌هایی مانند حق و حقوق زنان، دموکراسی، تفسیرهای نوین و لیبرال از دین، حقوق اقلیت‌ها، حکومت قانون، نهادسازی و نهادهای مدنی، محیط زیست، روزنامه نگاری و امنیت فضای مجازی و موبایل‌های هوشمند. آموزشکده توانا کلاس‌های دلخواه شما را رایگان به منزل شما می‌آورد. در کلاس‌های توانا با نام و جیمیل مستعار ثبت نام کنید. برای ما مهم انگیزه شهروندی و علاقه شما به آموختن است. ما هرگز نام واقعی شما را نمی‌پرسیم. تیم فنی توانا از طریق سایت تواناتک به شما کمک می‌کند تا با خیال راحت و فارغ از دردسرهای امنیت وب در کلاس‌ها شرکت کنید. در توانا بیاموزید، با تواناتک پاسخ سوال‌های فنی خود را بگیرید و از صدها کتاب، ویدئو، آدیو و مدرک دیجیتال در کتابخانه توانا رایگان استفاده کنید. توانا پنجره آشنایی شما با جهان ایده‌های نو و تجربه مردم دیگر کشورها در گذار به دموکراسی. برای دسترسی به توانا و اطلاعات بیشتر به فیسبوک، توییتر، یوتیوب و گوگل پلاس توانا و تواناتک بپیوندید.